We are going to be talking about cellular respiration and photosynthesis today, which I know some of us have already started getting into the lessons about that stuff. We're also going to be kind of talking about the collaborative project and how you can design an experiment to prove some of these things that we're learning about. So I'm going to go ahead and mute some of you guys here. And if you don't have your camera on, please turn your camera on, right up so that I can know that you're actually here and that you're not just logged in. You do not have to be visible the whole time, right? You're welcome to tilt your video up or move yourself a little bit to the side so that you're not fully in the camera. But I have already had one person this year who thought they could just log into Zoom and stay logged in through all 3 of my virtual sessions and still get credit even though they weren't there. Yeah, so I'm aware of that kind of stuff, guys, so make sure that your video's on and you're participating. So we will start here with doing a couple of announcements / reminders here. Uh-oh, I hear people entering. Let's see, participants. All right, so next week on October 13th, there is no school, right? That's a Friday, so that means that we have no virtual sessions on that day, right? On October 20th, we are gonna have our second lab, which is the liver enzyme lab. That is going to be either on campus or virtual, right? If you come on campus, you're gonna get to interact with some chicken livers, and we're gonna learn about enzymes and what kind of conditions are the best for an enzyme to function. So today what we're gonna do is we're going to define and draw the cell processes of photosynthesis. That's right, no virtual session next Friday because there's no school. We will describe the relationship between photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and then the exit ticket today, which I will kind of give you a little hint about, is to devise an experiment to prove the relationship and or that one of the processes is even occurring, right? So really thinking about like, okay, well, we hear that photosynthesis exists. How can we prove that it's happening? So our warm-up question is going to be a hard one, I think. Which part of the cell do you think is the most important and why? So take about 30 seconds or so to think about this, and you could pop your answer into the chat when you have decided what part of the cell is the most important. Bella says nucleus with a question mark. Destiny agrees. Nucleus, now we're getting some reasons here because it's the center. The nucleus because it dictates what each organelle needs to do and how the cell itself is structured. I think it's a trick question. You're right, Juliana, it is definitely kind of a trick question, but still, really, it's to help you start thinking about all the parts and what they do. Mitochondria, that's an interesting suggestion because it makes the energy, right? It's the powerhouse. Let me ask you guys this, though. What if we're talking about a bacteria cell? There's no nucleus, there's no mitochondria. So what's going to happen? What would be the most important part of a bacterial cell? Anyone have any ideas for the most important part of a bacterial cell? Ribosomes? Yeah, I would say that's definitely up there, Bella. Uh, Ribosomes are going to make proteins, right? And that's pretty much like most of what a bacteria cell does. There is some DNA, right? We could say DNA is an important part. It's not really an organelle, but it's there. Okay, so just kind of thinking about what these parts do, right? And whoever said that it was a trick question, you're right. It's not really a trick, but it's true that all parts are important, right? There's nothing in the cell that we could just get rid of and the cell would be okay. So where does the DNA get stored if a bacteria does not have a nucleus? Jordan asks. It doesn't really get stored, right? There's not a lot going on in the cell, so it actually forms like a ring structure, and it just sits in the cell. And eventually we'll talk about viruses as well, and they're sort of similar, that they're just this sac that has either DNA or RNA inside of it. And it doesn't have to be protected, right? Because DNA is surrounded by proteins pretty much all the time, and then it only gets unwound when we want to copy it. So think about like a spool of yarn, right? Usually it's tightly in a spool, but if you want to use the yarn, you start unwinding it. DNA is kind of the same way. It's like compacted into a ball, and then when you want to use it, you can open it up, and those proteins will actually move. All right, so first we're going to talk about photosynthesis. A question here to kind of that gets answered by photosynthesis is, how do plant cells get energy from the sun to usable chemical energy? So a lot of us are probably already familiar with this concept of photosynthesis, right? You might have heard of it in middle school, in other science classes, in your general life. But this might be a new component here, the energy transfer that's actually occurring, right? We're taking energy from the sun, which is radiation energy. Plants capture that energy, and then they actually convert that into a chemical energy that we can use, right? We cannot capture energy from the sun and make sugar. That would be awesome. And then we would all be sitting outside, right, trying to absorb the sun so that we could make food. But that's not how we get our energy. We get our energy from consuming. So it's important to note that that chemical energy is in the bonds of the molecule that's produced. And so when photosynthesis ends, we end up with a glucose, a C6H12O6 molecule, right? 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. And all the bonds in that compound of glucose, that's where the energy is stored. So we talked about ATP last week, and we talked about energy being stored in that last phosphate bond. When that bond was broken, right, energy shot out of the ADP, which was a little bit of an exaggeration, but energy was released. Guess where that energy is coming from? It's coming from this glucose molecule, right? So we're actually kind of going backwards. Although we will see here which one came first, photosynthesis or cellular respiration, I don't know. So that glucose molecule is where that chemical energy is going to get stored. So when we're talking about any cell process, we want to think about these 4 things, right? What is it? So a basic definition. Where does it occur, right? Is it in an organelle? Is it happening in the cytoplasm? Is it happening in the nucleus? Where is it happening? What is needed and what is produced, right? In this case, we are having a reaction happen. So what do we need for that reaction? And then what is actually produced from that reaction? When we talk about protein synthesis, right, it will be slightly different. It's not necessarily a formula, but still we want to think about what do we need to make a protein and then what is produced while a protein. So these are the 4 questions you want to ask yourself about every cell process. So a definition of photosynthesis, right, this is a long, wordy one. The process of plants capturing energy from the sun and converting it into chemical energy in the form of glucose. So what does that mean, right? That's a lot of words. Really, the basic definition, what the word actually means, right, if we break the word down, is photo means what? What do you guys think photo means? Think about photography. Capture. It's a good guess. It means light, right? And then what does synthesis mean? To make. So if we translate the word literally, it means light to make, right? Which really we can kind of imagine, okay, using light to make what? To make sugar, right? So you can kind of add the word sugar in your mind there. Using light to make sugar is the short and easy definition of this, right? But of course, we want to be thinking about that chemical energy is stored in those bonds in glucose. And we know from our macromolecule learning, right, that glucose can make a bunch of different things. We can make starches, right? We can make other sugars, not necessarily from glucose, but we can make starches that store glucose. And some of you guys might have even been thinking, or you should have been thinking, on the quiz you took about ATP, I forgot what it was called, I think cellular energy or something like that. They talked about fat as a storage. Let me ask you this, what is fat storing? It's not storing glucose, right? So how are we getting energy from fat? We're going to come back to that question. But how are we getting that energy? Right? It's not directly explained in that lesson. So I want you guys to be thinking about that as we go through this. Okay. So how are we getting energy from fat? We will see. Well, maybe we'll see. So where does photosynthesis take place? Right, it takes place in the chloroplast. We should recall from our plant cell word wall that we made and the notes that you took, right, that the chloroplast is only in plant cells. It's also in algae, which is a type of protist, and it is in some bacteria cells, right? There are bacteria that can do photosynthesis. So chloroplasts are not found in us, right? They are actually what give plants their green color. So even looking at a plant, you can tell where those chloroplasts are, right? Because in the green leaves, if the stem is green, right, those are places where there's a lot of chloroplasts, and therefore photosynthesis can be taking place. And it makes sense if you think about a tree. Who's seeing the sun in a tree? The leaves, right? The trunk is not exposed to the sun as much, right? The roots are clearly not exposed to the sun, so we don't see green in the roots or the trunk. So inside that chloroplast, we have chlorophyll, which is actually the green pigment, which is why I made it green colored here, and enzymes that work together to create that glucose. You guys followed the carbon molecule if you've done the photosynthesis lesson. It's pretty complicated, right? There's many, many phases of photosynthesis. There's also photosynthesis that can happen in the dark, which seems kind of strange because you think, well, we might need light to do it. Yes, but there's ways that it can happen in the dark, right? And it's a pretty complicated process. So if you were able to trace that carbon and actually kind of just get a general idea of how this is working, that's all you're really going to need for this class. As a reminder, or if you're not sure about this, an enzyme is a protein, right? And they break down or build molecules. So one example is your saliva, right? When you start chewing in your mouth, your saliva actually starts breaking down sugars in your mouth. Okay, so we also see a picture here of what the chloroplast looks like and all the different parts of the chloroplast. The chloroplast has its own membrane, and there are a lot of theories that chloroplasts used to actually be their own organism, right? And they ended up getting in plant cells. Plant cells ate chloroplasts, and one day they just didn't break it down and it became part of the cell, which is pretty interesting. Mitochondria are the same way. Do zooxanthellae, I don't know how to say that bacteria, in photosynthetic coal work in a similar way? Yes, right? So anytime you're seeing something about photosynthesis, bacteria, it's not exactly the same as in a plant, but it's the same concept. Taking that light, capturing the energy, and then converting it into a chemical bond. Oh, in coral. Okay. I was going to say in coal. Coral, yes, definitely. Right, so coral are like, they seem sort of like plants. If they're able to photosynthesize, that means they have chloroplasts. So then we want to look at our equation for photosynthesis. And again, we're thinking about what's needed and what's produced. Right, this looks so simple. In fact, you might be thinking, wow, this doesn't seem too hard. But if you actually trace all the steps that happen in a plant cell, right, you will realize that it's much more complicated than this. But what do we need for the process to happen? Well, we need carbon dioxide, right? And we'll talk about where that's coming from in a little bit. We need water. Well, we know where that's coming from, right? It's raining, plants are being watered by you, possibly, and the roots are absorbing that water. And we need light, right? Sunlight is best, arguably. However, right, fluorescent lighting or other kinds of lighting inside your house can also be used. That's why plants can live inside, right? That light works. Then what do we make? We make sugar and we make oxygen, right? And the sugar that is usually produced is glucose. There are other situations where different sugars can be produced that we're not going to learn about in this class. And then there is oxygen, which we know is super important for us, right? And we're very thankful that plants produce oxygen. So a little summary diagram, right? The leaves are where most of this is happening. That's where the chlorophyll is at the highest concentration, which is in the chloroplasts. They trap that light energy. You can read about how that actually happens. It's pretty interesting. Water obviously coming from the roots, light coming from the sun or some other light source. And then plants actually have on the bottom of their leaves little tiny holes. They're called stomata, which is spelled stomata. And these are the tiny holes in plant cells. And what they do is they open and close using a specific type of cell called a guard cell. And they allow gas exchange in plants, right? So that's kind of how plants breathe. They don't have lungs necessarily, but that does not mean that they're not controlling the gases entering and exiting the organism, right? So in this case, the stomata, these tiny holes in the bottom of the leaf, can open and close to allow carbon dioxide to come in, to allow oxygen to leave, right? And depending on the environment they're in or what season it is, those stomata might be closed more than they are open, right? Because water also can escape through the plant leaves as a vapor. And then we go through the process and oxygen is released into the air, also through those stomata. And the sugar, glucose, usually in plants, it gets converted into a starch. So if we think of a great example of a starch, we could think of a potato. A potato is a root, right? It's 100% starch. That is where a potato plant stores its sugar, right? It stores it in the roots. Other plants store the sugar in different places, right? Fruits, usually the sugar gets converted into fructose, which is similar to glucose. And that is going to be a separate process that happens after. So that's a good little summary. I would definitely have something like this drawn in your notes. I know it might seem weird to draw this, but the act of drawing this is actually going to kind of help you remember the process. So that was photosynthesis. So now we're going to talk about the same thing, cellular respiration, right? How do plant and animals? This is occurring in all cells. It's even occurring in bacteria, but they're not using a mitochondria to do it. So how do plants and animals break down sugar to get energy, right? We talked about that specific energy that we are getting, which is ATP. So now we're going to talk more about the process that produces that ATP. So again, we're going to answer those 4 questions. What is it? Where does it occur? What is needed? What is produced? And then I added a 5th question here. How is it related to photosynthesis? Right? So how are cellular respiration and photosynthesis related? So cellular respiration, a good definition here, pretty short one, is plant and animal cells use oxygen to break down glucose and get energy. Sounds pretty straightforward. Again, much like cellular respiration, it is not straightforward. And much like photosynthesis, it is not straightforward. And there's like 1,000 steps. I'm going to briefly overview a few of the main ones. So glucose is going to come from your food. A lot of you guys rocked this question on that cellular energy quiz, right? Describing how food does not just suddenly become energy, that there's a process to convert it into ATP. What happens is cellular respiration can occur with or without oxygen. So when oxygen is there, we are very happy. We are getting a ton of ATP, right? And basically that's why we need oxygen to survive. So when we have glucose and oxygen, we end up getting 34 more ATP plus these 2 original ones we get. So we get 36 ATP, right? Which you're probably like, all right, well, I don't know how much ATP cells are using, right? But that sounds like a pretty good amount. That's from 1 molecule of glucose, right? When you eat something, there's way more than 1 molecule of glucose, so therefore you're going to be getting a ton of ATP. If we don't have oxygen, the cell basically will kind of try to stay alive until oxygen's available. Unless you're a special organism, which we'll talk about in a second, but if you're an animal and you don't have oxygen, you go through a process called fermentation and you produce a waste product called lactate. Lactate is a poison, right? And guess what happens to it? It immediately gets broken down, right? Otherwise it will kill the cell. And you only get 2 ATP, which is really just enough to go through the process again, and is not enough to power any other activities. It's just enough to keep trying to make more ATP. In other words, waiting for more oxygen to be there. So you have probably experienced this if you've ever had a muscle cramp, right? If you've ever been running or doing some kind of intense exercise, right? And all of a sudden you get that cramp and you're like, and what do? You stop and you start breathing, right? Because that means that that particular part of your body does not have enough oxygen and you're producing this lactate and you can actually feel it, right? It's burning. That burning muscle cramp is because you are lacking oxygen in that muscle. Now, yeast in plants, they actually make alcohol when they go through fermentation. So eventually they will die, but they can live a lot longer than animals can without oxygen. Plants, not so much. Yeast, definitely. So we actually use this process to create foods for ourselves, right? Alcoholic products, beer, wine, kombucha, right? And also this process can be used to make bread. Yeast will actually rise, like help bread rise when they are deprived of oxygen. So we use these processes to make cheese as well. Excellent, Ariella. Right, so a ton of processes actually involve us manipulating organisms, forcing them to go through fermentation, and then we eat or drink or enjoy those products. Right, so yeast especially are used heavily in fermentation process. And that is going to be something that might help us design an experiment later, to be thinking about yeast and fermentation. So once that happens, if there's no oxygen, we take that 2 ATP, we go back to a glucose, and we try to break it down again, hoping that this time we could go the oxygen route. So lactate is different than lactose. That was a great question from Alexandria. She says, if lactose is a poison, is that why some people are lactose intolerant? So lactate is different than lactose, but to answer your question, the reason why some people are lactose intolerant is they don't have an enzyme that breaks down lactose, right? So lactose is actually also a type of sugar. It is a sugar that's found in dairy products, right? And some people, there's levels, right? Some people have no enzymes to break it down. Those are the people that get like super sick if they eat dairy or cheese. Some people have a low level of enzymes where they can kind of break it down. That might be like maybe cheese upsets your stomach, but you're me and you just eat it anyways because you love cheese. And then there's also people who have tons of enzymes that can break down lactose, and they are not lactose intolerant, right? Because they can eat as much as they want and break it down. So that actually has to do with genetics and an enzyme. But lactate is a little bit different. I know it looks similar, but it is a poison. So then if we ended up getting oxygen, we go through a bunch of other compounds here. And then the mitochondria is basically like a little factory where the membrane is used to basically go through a cycle in the membrane and produce ATP. So this is kind of the whole process if oxygen is present. We start with glucose. We go through the first step, which is glycolysis, right? We produce those 2 ATPs. If we have oxygen, we keep going. If we don't, we cycle back and try again. If we have oxygen, we have a compound called pyruvic acid, which actually enters the mitochondria. It goes through something called the Krebs cycle, right, where electrons are transferred. We have these helper molecules, NADH and FADH2. And we also have an electron transport chain. This is where an insane amount of ATP is produced, right? This is where the bulk of the 34 ATPs from this process come from, is from that electron transport chain. I would recommend reading about how this process happens or watching a video about how this process happens so that you can kind of see how complicated it is on a molecular level, right? This is an overview. Remember, you can use notes and references on the tests and quizzes, right? So there's no reason to not try to learn about this as in depth as possible. So where is this occurring? Well, I kind of gave it away here, but it's occurring in the mitochondria, right? Which again has its own membrane. It also has all these membranes inside. It looks kind of gross, I think personally, as an organelle, because I judge how organelles look, but it is super, super efficient at producing ATP. So you actually inherited your mitochondria from your mom, right? The egg cell that produced you contained mitochondria. Sperm cells don't have mitochondria, which is why they don't live forever. And egg cells kind of do live forever until they become an organism. Anyways, mitochondria comes from your mom, right? So they can actually use mitochondria to trace genetics of people and see sort of different evolutions. There's a lot of sports and exercise research going on about, if people have more mitochondria in their cells genetically, does that make them better at sports? And the answer is usually yes, right? Because they're more efficient at using oxygen and producing energy for the muscles. But anyway, there's a lot of research going on about that kind of stuff. The mitochondria is still kind of misunderstood. It actually has its own DNA, right? Again, it used to be its own organism that was most likely eaten and then actually became part of a cell. So you have mitochondrial DNA inside your cells that's actually separate from your DNA. The mitochondrial DNA is found in the mitochondria, right? It's not in the nucleus. It's completely separate. Pretty interesting stuff. So our cellular respiration equation, thinking about what we need and what we produce, right? We need glucose. Where we're getting that from, our food. We need oxygen. Where are we getting that from? We're breathing in. And then what do we produce? Well, mainly our biggest excitement and concern here is that we produce ATP. Meanwhile, we're also producing water and carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is going to be released when you breathe out, and water is going to either be used by your cells or released as waste in the form of urine. Right? So these water and carbon dioxide are more like waste products here. Energy is like the one that we really care about. So now that we've seen cellular respiration and photosynthesis, I want you guys to tell me how they're related. To summarize this, and I would put this in your notes for sure, this is 100% going to be a DBA question for this module, explaining how photosynthesis and cellular respiration are related. So spend about, let's say, a minute and a half thinking about this and writing how they are related. It might help you to write the equations down first, which I will also do here as you're working. All right, if anyone is feeling brave and wants to suggest their answer, or you don't have to say the whole thing you wrote, but give us a description of how cellular respiration and photosynthesis are related, because we're going to talk about this and go over it and make sure that everyone understands here. So I'll wait and see if anyone wants to propose their answer. Otherwise, make sure you have these equations written down next to each other like we have here, because that's going to help us discuss this. All right, Elizabeth, thank you for being a brave volunteer. During cellular respiration, plant and animal cells use oxygen to break down glucose and get energy. Great definition. During photosynthesis, plants capture energy from the sun and convert it into glucose. Photosynthesis makes the glucose that cellular respiration uses to make energy. You're exactly right. So the biggest connection here to realize is that these equations are a cycle. They're cyclical, right? What is produced in photosynthesis is used in cellular respiration. And what is produced in cellular respiration is used in photosynthesis. The only thing that changes here is the energy source, right? In photosynthesis, we're taking energy from the sun. In cellular respiration, we're producing ATP. And I put here 34 to 38 because there's actually discrepancy on how many ATPs are produced. So they are essentially the circle of life is how they're related here, right? What's produced in photosynthesis is used in cellular respiration. So that means plants, hate to break it to you, they can pretty much exist without us, right? As long as carbon dioxide and water are around, they don't need animals or humans at all, right? They can just do both of these processes. They do photosynthesis, take that glucose and oxygen, use it to make ATP, then they could go back to photosynthesis, then back to cellular respiration, and back and back and back, and keep going in a cycle. Whereas we really need oxygen in order to produce energy, right? And our major source of oxygen on Earth is from plants. So, am I saying plants can survive without any animals? Because Ariella says, what about the bees? No, right? Obviously, they need bees to help them pollinate and reproduce, which is important, right? They don't all need that, though. So we can think back to plants have been around for millions and millions and millions of years. Why? Because they can do both of these things. Honestly, I think is one of the biggest arguments. They can also survive in low oxygen situations, right? Certain types of plants, which can help them if, for example, the amount of oxygen on Earth ever changed. Well, we would die, but plants would probably survive, right? They survive mass extinctions, volcanoes, meteors, temperature changes, all these different things. And a lot of it has to do with them being able to do both processes. Now, I'm not saying plants are better than us because, let's face it, they can't move, which is pretty important. So they have their drawbacks, but they are winning here on the cell processes game because they're doing both of these. So that is also the reason why, which might help you with your exit, if you breathe on a plant, right, you talk to a plant, it might actually help it grow. Because let's say you have two plants. Plant A, you give zero attention, you just water it and you don't even like breathe near it. Plant B, you talk to it for an hour a day. Sounds a little strange to talk to a plant, or you breathe next to it for an hour a day, right? That could be a valid experiment to suggest that possibly plant B might grow more, right? Or have more leaves even because it's getting an extra supply of carbon dioxide, right? We could also, if we had unlimited equipment, we could put a plant in a room with carbon dioxide. We could actually measure the amount of carbon dioxide in the room, and then in 5 days, check how much carbon dioxide is in the room. And if it's just a plant in there, right, there should be less. The plant should be taking in that carbon dioxide and producing sugar, right? So that's kind of what I want you guys to be thinking about when we move into this next part is like, how can we prove this? Like, this sounds cool, and I'm glad someone came up with these equations and these processes, but how do we prove it? So how would plants get carbon dioxide if there were no humans to breathe it out? So the carbon cycle, right? Carbon dioxide actually gets put into the air in a bunch of different ways other than humans. We can help produce carbon dioxide, but we are not the only way, right? In fact, rocks can dissolve carbon dioxide into water, and then that carbon dioxide can find its way into the air, right? That's one way, for example, where we don't need a living thing. Other things is remains of animals. So let's say all the animals died, right? Carbon is stored in those decaying remains. Those could also get put into water and put into the air through the carbon cycle. So that is a great question from Bella, though. How do they get carbon dioxide if there's no humans, right? Also, other animals are breathing out carbon dioxide. So even things like insects, right? Really small animals like rats or squirrels or whatever, those animals are producing carbon dioxide as well. So the source for carbon dioxide is vast, right? Which is part of why we have global warming, because we have too much. Meanwhile, the source of oxygen is limited because plants are pretty much 90% of the way that oxygen gets put into the air, right? It can also come from water. We'll talk about that a little bit. Oh, wait, no, sorry. I'm going to talk about that in my earth science class. You guys aren't going to talk about it. But oxygen is much harder to come by than carbon dioxide, right? In early Earth, there was a ton of carbon dioxide and not very much oxygen. So we're going to practice with a few questions here. Just about these general concepts, you guys are going to be typing in the chat 1, 2, 3, or 4 instead of A, B, C, D. So this first question is, in a plant cell, the synthesis of sugar compounds from inorganic raw materials occurs in the... So what do you guys think? 1, 2, 3, or 4? I see a lot of 4s, which is great. Yeah, right? The synthesis of sugar, the hard part about this question is we have to make sure we know that means photosynthesis. So therefore, it's occurring in the chloroplast, right? Otherwise, we might have been tempted to pick mitochondria, or we don't know, maybe processes that happen in the nucleus yet, or in the cell membrane. So we probably wouldn't have picked those. Okay, this is one of my favorite ones because this is hard and this is totally a type of like state test question. Which word equation represents the process of photosynthesis? So looking at the words, which one is photosynthesis? You guys are fast. Lots of 2s, which is great. 2 is the correct answer, right? What I would have done for this one is straight up looked for which one is using carbon dioxide, right? The only choice that's using carbon dioxide is choice 2. Choice 1, if we're taking glucose and we're making alcohol and carbon dioxide, what are we doing in answer choice 1? What process do you think that would be? Elizabeth was paying attention. Fermentation, right? So that's actually a part of cellular respiration, choice 1. Choice 2 is photosynthesis. Choice 3 is nothing, right? That doesn't look like anything. That actually doesn't exist as a process. Chlorophyll and water making glucose and alcohol? No. Choice 4 is slightly confusing. We see glucose and oxygen making carbon dioxide and water. What do we think choice 4 might represent? Elizabeth's too fast. I'm gonna have to put you on mute on the chat, Elizabeth. No, I'm just kidding. I'm gonna make you wait 5 seconds. Cellular respiration, or CR, nicely abbreviated by Bella, right? We're taking glucose and oxygen, making that carbon dioxide and water. So make sure that you, in those equations, you understand the words and also the symbols, because you might see it either way. And then this is a hard question, I think. Which factor least influences the rate of photosynthesis? We're talking about least. So I saw a 1 and then a bunch of 4s, right? So the 4s have it. The best way to answer these kind of questions with the least, right, is to do process of elimination. So could the atmospheric conditions influence photosynthesis? Maybe. We'll come back to that one. What about time of day? Well, yeah, if it's really sunny, then it's probably photosynthesis is gonna be happening really quickly, right? If it's cloudy or nighttime or dusk, it's probably not happening as much. Number of chloroplasts, that's gonna matter, right? If you don't have a lot of chloroplasts, photosynthesis is probably not happening that much. And then this last one, concentration of nitrogen. Well, do we need nitrogen in the process of photosynthesis? No, right? So the correct choice is 4 for that exact reason, that would least influence. Atmospheric conditions might, nitrogen definitely is not influencing. Okay, I like that ugly circle I just drew there. And then our last and final slide here is our exit ticket, which should be available to you on your Canvas calendar. And it says this exact thing. This one is a little longer than most of our exits because you can actually use this to be your collaboration project. So I don't know how many of you guys have actually taken a glance at the collaboration projects, but there are 4 options. And there are 5 components to the project, which you could read about separately on your own. But one of the possible options is design and build a model of a cell to demonstrate osmosis and diffusion. You guys kind of already did that one with the egg. So if you choose to do that one, right, you're going to have to step up your model a little bit. The second option is to design an experiment or model to prove that cellular respiration and photosynthesis are related, right? Defining the equations, explaining how they relate, and describing how your experiment models the relationship between these two. I will also accept an experiment to prove that photosynthesis or cellular respiration are occurring, right, which I will add in here. So that's one of your options. 3 is a pretty hard one here, but design and create, if possible, a system that will generate biofuel from waste. And then the last option is to design a self-contained ecosystem using these requirements, which takes you to a separate page. Right, we're going to be selecting our partners soon and starting to work on these projects. So I thought, why not spend some time thinking about how we could design an experiment for number 2, and that might end up being something that you choose. I'm also going to pop the code word here into the chat. Shout outs to Destiny on this one. And I want you guys in this exit to really think about designing the experiment and describing it to me in 1 to 2 paragraphs, right? So don't just say, I would put a plant in a room and measure the amount of whatever. No, no, no. I want an experiment that's going to prove this. You might have to research, right? You might not know what tools there are. We do have ways to measure carbon dioxide in the air. We do have ways to measure oxygen in the air, right? So you might want to think about that. And again, this could be your collaboration project or not, but regardless, it's a good exercise to kind of tell us, how do we know that these things are true? Because we shouldn't just take what scientists tell us and say, yeah, all right, photosynthesis, I guess it's happening. How can we prove it? All right, so do we have any questions about this, about the class? Generally, make sure you got that code word to turn in this exit ticket to get full credit. If you don't have the code word, you will be able to get a 90%. There's not a submission option. Uh-oh, that could be possible. I might have clicked no submission. Keep in mind, if you choose option 4 for your collaboration project about the ecosystems, that's the last thing we're going to be learning about, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't start already thinking about that as well. And it says you should be able to turn something in. Yes, Jordan, you are right. That is the code word. Let me check. You might try refreshing, Elizabeth. You should be able to submit. Yeah, text enter your web URL. You should be able to submit. Yeah, I think it wasn't this morning. I fixed it. So, can you do the collaboration project by yourself? What a great question. I would prefer that you try to work with someone else. If you have a specific reason why you would like to work alone, for example, you have a really insane schedule, right? Or you really have issues with working with other people, etc., then you can write me an email and we can talk about it. What time is the lab on the 20th? It is at 9 a.m. And hopefully we get some people coming in because we're going to play with some chicken livers. It's going to be exciting. It's one of my favorite labs. Any other questions? What does self-sustained mean exactly? Right? If you read the sheet that it links to, it kind of gives you more details, but it means that it's closed off from the rest of the world and able to completely function and everything lives. Yep. So Charlie, that would mean like you aren't watering it, you're not putting food into it. It's completely independent of Earth. What was the chicken liver thing? What day? That will be October 20th. So in 2 weeks at 9 a.m. Right? There will be a virtual session. So if you're unable to attend in person, you can attend virtually and you can see the whole experiment happen. And that will be another lab, and we're going to do a lab write-up for that as well. Next week, right, the 13th, Friday the 13th, there is no school and no virtual sessions. I got lucky having my virtual sessions on Fridays because we're going to end up missing some, which I shouldn't be excited about because I like doing them, but it'll be nice to have a little break. So yeah, that doesn't mean you can't turn in work on that Friday. I'll probably be working, so feel free to send me an email if you get stuck, and I'll respond as soon as I can. Otherwise, if we don't have any more questions, I am going to end the meeting, right? Make sure you got the code word. I'm going to type it in the chat for the last time because I know a few people said BRB. And then I will see you guys on the 20th for chicken livers. Bye. An assignment due on the 13th. I will fix that and make it due on the 12th. Thank you.